NBA trades over the last couple of years have gotten increasingly complicated. We've got pick swaps, we've got teams trading away 7 first-round picks, multiple young players, and I would argue that the beginning of all that, the first real blockbuster superstar trade with all these complicated pieces was the Anthony Davis trade in 2019. What I like to do with these trades is I go back and take a look at what these pieces have ended up becoming for these teams. Not just who they ended up selecting with the draft picks, but once they traded a player and then traded those pieces for another player, and then traded those pieces for another player, on and on down the road. The Anthony Davis trade is actually almost done. We almost know where all the pieces ended up, and that's what we're going to be talking about today. First, let's go over what the trade looked like the day that it was made. This is the way that the trade broke down the day that they actually sent Anthony Davis to the LA Lakers. Okay, so it is Davis to the Lakers in exchange for Lonzo Ball, Josh Hart, Brandon Ingram, the number 4 pick in the 2019 draft, which had not happened yet. The Lakers got great lottery luck in order to move up to the 4th overall pick in that draft. Without that, the trade arguably doesn't happen. At least it doesn't happen at the time. They also receive a 2022 first round pick, a 2023 first round pick swap, and a 2024 or 2025 first round pick. New Orleans gets to choose which year that happens in. And there's a lot of different directions you can go in. A lot of things have happened to each of these pieces that have been sent to New Orleans. And first I want to talk about Lonzo Ball. Lonzo shows up in New Orleans and pretty clearly, immediately he didn't really want to be there. He envisions himself in LA with the Lakers. It's where he's from. He went to UCLA. Like, that's just where he wanted to be. And in New Orleans, he was good. I think he was a really good connecting piece for them, figured out how to shoot the ball better, spent a couple of seasons in New Orleans, but ultimately they decide to move him because they don't want to give him a big contract extension. He ends up in Chicago, and this is one of the first crimes of the Anthony Davis trade, is that New Orleans got so little in exchange for Lonzo Ball. They basically got Thomas Satoransky. We're going to talk about what he ends up becoming later. They get Garrett Temple, and they get a 2nd round pick, and that's it for Lonzo Ball. And obviously Lonzo now is having injury issues in Chicago, but at the time that deal was made, they signed and traded him away. That was just simply not enough value, especially a guy that was a former number 2 overall pick and was a critical part, arguably the 2nd best asset behind Brandon Ingram in the entirety of the initial Anthony Davis trade. And as it reads today, they basically got a 2nd round pick as in place of Lonzo Ball in that initial trade. Next guy I want to talk about is Josh Hart. He spends 2.5 seasons in New Orleans, really develops well there, continues to become someone that now on the Knicks and just continually on multiple different teams is a guy you want to have. He hasn't been shooting the ball as well lately, but he can guard, gives great energy, and was a piece that, the Lakers certainly would have liked to keep in that initial deal. They actually end up moving Josh Hart after 2.5 seasons in something that becomes really critical to understanding what the Anthony Davis trade now looks like, and that is the CJ McCollum and also Larry Nance trade for New Orleans. So they trade away Hart. Satoransky, who I mentioned in the previous section, he also was included in that trade, and in addition to a couple of other pieces that we're going to talk about here later. And so Josh Hart now is basically replaced in the initial reading of that Davis trade as a piece in the CJ McCollum trade, plus of course the 2.5 seasons that he spent in New Orleans. So just go ahead and file that away for now. We're going to talk more about the CJ McCollum trade later, but understand that Josh Hart was a big part of that. Next up is another part of this that New Orleans arguably screwed up, and that is the 4th overall pick in the 2019 draft. They immediately after acquiring that pick got a lot of interest in terms of trading that pick away, and they ultimately trade the 4th pick away to Atlanta in exchange for 2 first-round picks, one of which becomes Jackson Hayes, one of which becomes Nickeil Alexander-Walker. Now, DeAndre Hunter on the Pelicans right now would be an upgrade over either Hayes, who's still on the team, or Alexander-Walker, who got traded away, which we'll talk about here in a little bit. And if you just kept that pick and had him there, obviously this would have worked out much better for New Orleans. And again, you're looking at a situation where they're kind of giving away pieces. It's never something you want to do when you get multiple assets in exchange for a superstar, and then you start just letting those guys go essentially for free, as we talked about with Lonzo, as we talked about as well in this section with the 4th overall pick. No disrespect to Jackson Hayes, he's fine, but DeAndre Hunter, despite his injury issues, would have been a much better asset to retain at this point. Now, the other pieces of that trade that sent away the 4th overall pick, as I said, are Nickeil Alexander-Walker. He also ends up in the CJ McCollum trade, so that helps them there. Also, they got 2 second-round picks in the deal, one of which was used in the Jonas Valanciunas-Steven Adams swap, and the other was Herb Jones, and that is a critical part to this. It's a little bit like the Marc Gasol thing, where it's like, oh yeah, we got Marc Gasol in the initial Pau Gasol trade, and now it looks better. It's a 2nd-round pick, right? But when you hit on a 2nd-round pick the way that you hit on Herb Jones, who's arguably one of the best perimeter defenders in the entire league, it certainly helps the trade, and having him now in the long term as a part of the long-term reading of the initial Anthony Davis trade is an interesting little wrinkle, and that only happens because they trade out of the 4th overall pick. So essentially, they traded away DeAndre Hunter in exchange for Jackson Hayes, a piece in the CJ McCollum trade, a piece in the Steven Adams trade, as well as Herb Jones. But of course, that's not even close to the end of all the draft picks that New Orleans received in this trade. In 2022, they also ended up with the 8th overall pick in the draft as a result of this deal, and that pick becomes Dyson Daniels, who I think is going to end up being a good player for them, a good two-way player. Certainly not a superstar level, high ceiling kind of guy, but someone that's certainly going to help them and is absolutely an asset. And then you also have this year's pick swap with the Lakers, which is getting really interesting because both of those teams could be in the lottery, and that just means that New Orleans gets the higher lottery selection. It's also possible, with the way that they've played lately and how poorly they played in the second half of the season, it's also possible that that pick swap means absolutely nothing, and for a while it looked like it could mean a lot. Now, things could happen where the Lakers get crazy lottery luck and then all of a sudden they get that pick rather than the Lakers. There's still a way that this works out really well for New Orleans, but it's also a possibility that they just end up with the higher pick than the Lakers. They don't do the pick swap, and this 2023 pick swap ends up reading as absolutely nothing in the long-term view of the Anthony Davis trade. And then of course you have the either 2024 or 2025 first round pick. The Pelicans get the opportunity to defer that pick to 2025 if they choose to, and that is the last and the final piece in terms of draft picks of the Anthony Davis trade. However, I've left one big thing out to the end of the video, and that is because it actually hasn't been moved. It's one of the few pieces in the initial trade that has not been moved, and that is Brandon Ingram. And I would argue that the entirety of the success of the Anthony Davis trade in the long term for New Orleans relies on Brandon Ingram and what he becomes. Because if him and Zion can figure it out and one, be healthy, and two, play well together, it sets them up to be one of the more dominant teams in the league over the next decade in the NBA. However, if he continues to struggle with injury issues and doesn't continue to raise his ceiling, especially defensively beyond what we've seen, then you're going to look at this situation and think, you gave away Lonzo. The CJ McCollum trade part is nice. We're going to talk about that in a second. But then it's basically Ingram and a couple of young guys that you got with the picks and not a whole lot else. And yes, Anthony Davis wanted to leave anyway. He was going to leave as a free agent. You kind of had to send him to the Lakers because that's the only team that he really wanted to play for. However, you always want to get maximum value in exchange for Anthony Davis. And I think a lot of people talk about this trade as one where you got a lot of value, but because of how they've mismanaged a few of the assets in the time since, the long-term reading of the trade maybe doesn't look as good as you think that it would. However, that can all be changed by Brandon Ingram becoming a perennial All-NBA caliber player, which I think he has the talent and the ceiling to do. And then of course I have to go through the entirety of the CJ McCollum and also Larry Nance aspects of this. That trade minus a first round pick that they traded on into the future to Portland was basically all pieces that they got in the Anthony Davis trade. So Josh Hart, Nickeil Alexander-Walker, as I mentioned earlier, they traded back in order to, they traded back out of 4 and they got Alexander Walker in that. There's some other pieces in there as well, but essentially that's how that section of the trade now reads when you're talking about Josh Hart as well as part of the 4th overall pick. They get CJ McCollum, they get Larry Nance, and CJ hasn't been fantastic this year, but I think is someone that has certainly helped the floor of their team. And if they continue to be successful over the next couple of seasons, CJ McCollum is going to be a big part of that. And you can basically replace him in this trade in the long-term viewing of it in replacement of guys like Josh Hart. So having said that, this is now how the Anthony Davis trade reads all these years later. Davis to the Lakers in exchange for Brandon Ingram, Dyson Daniels, Jackson Hayes, Herb Jones, most of the CJ McCollum and Larry Nance trade package. You can basically just put CJ McCollum and Larry Nance in here if you'd like to. A 2023 first round swap that may or may not happen, and the Lakers pick in either 2024 or 2025 unprotected. And to me, the big takeaways of this are, first of all, the trade's almost over. Like, it's kind of crazy. This is a trade that you would think, oh my gosh, it's going to last on and on and on and on. It's been framed even by me as a trade that, has this huge long-term impact on the Lakers. And certainly it has, and it matters in terms of what picks they do and don't have and can and can't trade. But if the Pelicans decide to keep their pick in 2024, then after that draft, the Anthony Davis trade is over. They've sent away all the assets they can possibly send away. And in my mind, that feels really, really quick because it felt like they were sending away a ton and a ton and a ton of future first round picks. Also, it's certainly a trade that they had to make. I don't think that changes anything. And I still think that the Lakers won the trade ultimately because they won the title. And if you win a title directly as a result of a trade, then you have to ultimately be the winner. We've talked about that, in the past. And then the Ingram part of this continues to be a massive deal to me. And if that's really like the pivot point of this trade in the long term, is if Brandon Ingram is just like a fine, sometimes all-star kind of player, then that's not really the foundational piece that you want in a superstar-like trade when you're trading away someone like Anthony Davis. But of course, if he raises his ceiling, then it changes the way this trade reads completely on down the road. And then lastly is that initially it always felt like, oh my gosh, they got so much for Anthony Davis. But because of the way the Lonzo thing worked out, and potentially depending on your evaluation of the CJ trade, depending on how that works out for you in your head, it actually doesn't seem like they got nearly as much, right? Like, it depends on what they get in 2023, what they get in 2024 with these draft picks, what Dyson Daniels becomes. Like, we're still not really going to fully know the extent of how well they did in this trade for years, probably. However, it certainly matters in terms of evaluating what the trade now looks like and reading it the way that I just did. It's actually not as much as maybe you would have initially thought. But that's gonna be the end of the video. I love doing trades like this. Let me know down in the comment section below what other trades you want me to cover in a series like this. Thank you guys so much for watching the video, and I'll see y'all next time.